Our final presenter is J.P. Daughton. J.P. is Associate Professor of History at Stanford University. He earned his PhD from Berkeley in 2002. His first book, An Empire Divided, Religion, Republicanism, and the Making of French, and then, what's the last word there?
Which book? Oh, sorry.
The first one.
I can't even remember.
The Making of French.
Colonial History. No.
Thanks.
French Empire. I don't know. Something.
That book. It's huge. It won the George Louis Beer Prize, the AHA, the Alf Andolph Heggie Book Prize from French Colonial Historical Society, and perhaps the most impressive, because writing good history is one thing, but writing good history someone who is not an historian might want to read is another. Back to Claire's. No, your point. Named a choice outstanding academic title. His cough through this. His second book, In God's Empire, French Missionaries in the Modern World, co-edited with Owen White, came out with Oxford in 2012. JP has published numerous articles and book chapters examining various aspects of French colonialism, including the Dreyfus Affair and the French Empire, colonial violence, and missionaries. And he's on the panel. I'm assuming you're working on a textbook on France and the world or something, but
I actually am.
Are you?
Well, it's a world history textbook.
Okay,
Yep.
There we go. Okay, thank you.
Anyway, well, thank you very much. I have to say that I think that this might be the one case of a panel that you've ever been to where the introduction of the speaker might actually be longer than what the speaker says. Because if Claire needed to learn new dance steps, I mean, I think really, from my perspective, to go with Lloyd's metaphor, the lights have been turned on in the gym and the DJ has packed up the sound system and there is nothing to say. So I was thinking, as everybody was talking about grad training, I know that there are a lot of grad students here at the Western, and part of the Western's mission is really about graduate training, and I've learned an important lesson, and that is never go forth on a roundtable discussion with three eminent historians in front of you, because they really have all covered pretty much, I think, what I wanted to say. I mean, I'll just sort of very briefly echo what everyone else has said as I say. The problem at Stanford is no better than anywhere else. I think in some ways it's probably worse. I mean, Stanford is obviously an extremely affluent institution, but I think that one thing that most people don't realize is that Stanford is a place where the humanities, I think, has for a long time been very ghettoized. I mean, we are a very strong humanities school, I think, but we have tiny classes. So the most relevant issue for me when I was asked to be on this was that I had decided this year to teach a class on basically 20th and a little bit of 21st century France. And I called it France since 1900. It was kind of a quick, sort of, I'll just call it France since 1900. You know how you're always late filling out the forms and so forth. Well, I ended up getting a grand total of 5 students signing up, 2 of whom are graduate students, actually. That sounds horrible, and it is bad, although for seminars at Stanford, that's not unheard of, certainly. But it is by far the smallest class I've taught since the last time I taught a class that had France in the title, which was Modern France, a few years ago when I had 5 students also. But I thought, all the terrorist attacks, all the, kind of horrible things, let's face it, that have brought France into the news would have made France, somehow more interesting. And I think that what I learned from this is that, I don't really think that there is a problem, a crisis in French history, but I do think that there's a crisis in the history of France. I mean, for all the reasons that my fellow speakers have said, I mean, France has sort of fallen from grace. But at least if students at Stanford are an indication, I think that there's more to it than that. I find that students at Stanford who, if they're taking humanities classes, like everyone else has said, they are really challenged by their peers, I think even more than by their professors. There's a really horrible thing at Stanford, and maybe this is elsewhere, I've only heard of it at Stanford, where when you come in as a student, you are designated by the student body, pretty much, socialized, as either a techie or a fuzzy. And if you're a techie, then you do something useful. You work in the hard sciences, you work in computer science, you work in engineering. Engineering really looms extraordinarily large at Stanford. And if you're fuzzy, well, What? I don't know. I mean, I've been there 15 years. I can't figure it out. You're a fuzzy. I mean, the implication, I think, is pretty clear. You do stuff that no one deems useful. So the kids who want to endure this kind of criticism, and many of our students who are admitted to work in the humanities end up going into other fields. I had 8 freshman advisees recently who I kind of advised all the way up to the point that they chose their major. And they made clear that after 3 days of orientation, that most of them were thinking about not majoring in the humanities. It was those 3 days was enough. 3 days of the techie fuzzy kind of dichotomy. And in the end, and maybe this is an indication that I'm, a great failure as an advisee. I'm not, on the barricades as much as I should be. 7 out of 8 of them ended up majoring in fields other than the humanities, even though all 8 came in wanting to. So this is, I think, kind of life for many of us. That said, I do think that there's a way in which you can help, and I guess the one minor, the half a paragraph that I have left that hasn't been discussed, might be a kind of practical way of thinking about teaching, and thinking about turning courses that used to be on the history of France into French history courses that are about themes, that are about phenomena and about ideas. And the courses that I teach that are on those sorts of issues, I've taught classes on capitalism and humanitarianism, human rights, colonialism, violence and culture, war and society, these sorts of things, do fine. I mean, they do exponentially better than the classes that have had the unfortunate word France in the title. And I floated this idea to my class of 5. And I said, I could have taught this class and called it, Antisemitism, War, Genocide, Empire, Decolonization, Immigration, and Terrorism. And one of them, who's not the smartest kid in the class, said, I would love to take that class. And I was like, you are taking that class. So anyway, they all agreed that that was the sort of way I should go, to sort of pander to their interests. But I think it's not, we need to understand that students today, I mean, at least Stanford students, and I know that we all have very different students, so it's important to hear from you all. They're interested in living a kind of global existence. I mean, they think of themselves as global citizens. And one of my students, actually, in this discussion, told me that advisors had told her that employers, and this is not somebody going into academia, just into business, want you to be able to do anything in the world. And therefore, you should avoid any sort of study that limits you to a region or to a nation. And I thought that was really, quite powerful. I mean, I think we all will have deep reservations about that from a purely kind of methodological perspective, right? I mean, we're historians. We believe in context. We believe in place. But I do think that there's a way in which you can pitch your classes on themes and events and still teach French history. I mean, that's what I do. All of my classes are French history. And I thought, I think John's point is really interesting, because and maybe it's because I was trained by Susanna Barrows, who's sort of, the Francophile of Francophiles. But I've always thought of myself as a French historian. I've never really thought of myself as a colonial historian. And I that's not to doubt, I'm sure that, Jay Winter and Bruno and all these people think of themselves as World War I historians. But I think that there are a lot of us who don't really look like French historians, but who are French historians. And, what choice do we really have but to battle on? I mean, we've got to continue to work. And I think one last point, going to Nina's opening remark, in a lot of ways, I think we have great benefits being French historians. We do have, revolution, we have citizenship, we have immigration, we have terrorism, we have empire. We have all these themes that are, for better or for worse, extraordinarily relevant today and are inherently of interest. And I don't really think German historians have that. I mean, the joke is always, the Germans have the Nazis, right? But that's kind of, I don't want to say that's it, but there are, I think, limitations. I mean, British history has really turned to the empire, I think, for similar reasons. For France, has, sort of tried to go global. And this isn't, one last point, I mean, I don't want to suggest everybody become a colonial historian. I mean, I have been accused of that in the past, and I don't think that's true at all. That's not what I'm saying. I mean, you can work on, gender and sexuality, you can work on government, bureaucracy, whatever it might be, and I still think that you can start to engage with books and people outside of your field to make it relevant. To make it more broadly relevant than just the history of France, to an understanding of kind of broader thematic topics. So I guess I'll just stop there. I've rambled long enough. I did ramble longer than my intro, but sorry. That was good.
We have slightly less than half an hour for discussion.
Can I add one thing?
Oh, please, yeah.
Let me just say one more thing that, building on what Lloyd said, is that, when you're thinking, if you want to reach, if the issue is how you make France relevant and communicate a knowledge of France and the importance of France to a bigger population, then pick topics that go in that direction. Don't do the history of the Lot-et-Garonne in the 1830s. I don't mean this to be self-referential, but my last 3 books have been about topics that are supposed to have some resonance, like terrorism or the demons of the 20th century. Massacre really is about the demons when you be killed for just existing. Ferguson, hand up, don't shoot, the Paris Commune, the same thing. Take topics that reach out and that are going to, you mentioned David Bell. I have a blurb on that book. Those are his old essays. His Total War was an attempt also to reach out. David Bell's books, and I'm happy mine also, get reviewed in the Wall Street Journal or in the New Yorker and these places, and people may not buy these books, but they're going to at least have a sense that stuff happened in France that is related to things that went on in Charleston, South Carolina recently, or in Nice in July, or Charlie Hebdo en janvier, or 13 November, and that sort of thing. So you can pick topics that have an appeal to a wider population, and if we paint ourselves in a corner, the way I did for decades, taking little topics, little slice of this town, little slice of that faubourg, then we limit our appeal. And the last thing finally is that if I sounded discouraged at the end of when I got done, one thing that gives me joy every day is because for whatever odd reason Yale puts these lectures online, and as while our enrollments, including mine, are declining, we still have tens of thousands of people for whatever reason do the history of modern France or do Europe 1648 to 1945, and so these universities in Stanford, you got them too, don't you, at Stanford? And I think Harvard has some too. Yale has a whole bunch of them. That's one way of reaching out. And I've gotten emails from 30 or 40 different countries, from the faubourg of Lahore, Pakistan, from people trying to understand what I'm saying. C'est pas possible. But there are ways of reaching out. There are ways of reaching these new audiences and picking topics that have that kind of appeal. It's not to get rid of academic credibility, but it's to pick topics with resonance, and this is feasible. It's possible.
Do we need an Oprah? Who wants to? Do you want to? I can do it. Okay. Okay. Jeremy, do you want to start? You need to wait for a microphone, so you...
These will not project, by the way, just so you're not surprised.
I just wanted to sort of throw something out, mostly for the audience. This has been a very present and contemporary history-minded panel. I know some of you teach French history before 1789. How can we bring that into the discussion? As you know, I am mostly a French Revolution modernist, but one book that I've taught in recent years that's gotten a real echo with my students is Mac Holt's book on the French Wars of Religion, because I told them, if you want to understand why the conflicts in places like Iraq and Syria are so intractable nowadays, here's an example from French history. But what else can we do to bring medieval and early modern France into this discussion?
Bob Wiener,
Actually,
Lafayette College.
Oh yeah, thank you. I was just going to say, could you please say who you are when you start, as Bob just did?
A couple of comments. John, I never thought I would bring myself to say this, but you got to get pissed off and say something to your alumni. When a department like yours gets cut the way you've been cut, you have to find a way to speak to alumni and raise some real hell. The administrators have to have some fear of universally known members of their faculty. And only if that happens can we bring force to bear. Another comment, though, and several years ago, I brought my 11-year-old grandchild to France. He took one bite of bread, ate one plate of cheese, and just looked in disbelief and said, "Why is this better than anything I can eat? And I live near New York." And the next grandchild is going this coming summer. So that we have to remember what we've bought into. I love to go to Israel. I love to go to Germany. But I go to Paris every June. And I go there because that's where I'm most at home and happiest. So you are correct in your analysis, there's no question. Lloyd, some of the suggestions you make and some of the suggestions others have made really are powerful and necessary, and we need to keep thinking and working on them. But it seems to me that teaching French history as part of European history, as part of global history, has a very rich future ahead of us, and I don't see how we can understand the world without understanding these things and being part of them. We have more leisure than ever on large parts of the population. Where do you think they're going to want to travel? Many will still want to go to Europe, even with Brexit. Maybe that's an issue for us that makes it harder, but I still like what I'm doing and think the books being published by the young people of this community are simply extraordinary.
Hi, guys. So my name is John Harvey. I'm a professor at St. Cloud State University, which is a 4-year comprehensive, or was a comprehensive, officially we can't call it that anymore, in Minnesota. We used to have 15,000 students. We've lost 25% in the last 6 years. Over the past 3 years, I've been heavily involved in my state, behind the scenes, meeting with state legislators from both parties, giving them briefings, going to hearings, and trying to address the collapse of enrollments that we are facing in the 4-year comprehensive university system in my state. And when you talk to them about history and you talk about the humanities, and you hook it into civics, everything that is said here, they like and they nod. And they would especially love what's been said here with Lloyd. But then something else happens. And I don't think we anticipated it for the previous 100 years. It's become market-driven. And now the teaching of civics, which was what we were built to do in the late 19th century, has become a commodity. And if you are a PhD degree granting university or a private university, you don't get defined. But if you are a public, non-flagship university, you are at their mercy. They say, why do I need someone with the PhD, the $100,000 salary plus benefits to deliver? We don't even teach, we deliver. To deliver a course when I can get a high school teacher who's never had a history class to teach 16-year-olds the same thing? Why do I need it when I have adjuncts? Why do I need it when we have online? Why? And no matter how much you say it, the market is destroying us from within. And I've bled on this, guys. And I don't know how to stop it because we can't even get unified. In all honesty, the top tier university faculties, you live in a different world than us. The private, especially the prestigious liberal arts, you live in a different world. The 2-year community colleges are often fighting, and they're taking our students away. It's not simply French history or European history. It's history. It's steadily eroding away. And the only thing after 3 years of working on this that I've been able to think of is we have to also hook whatever our specific problems are in our specific states to a wider philosophical argument that says, and you need someone with a PhD who is a professor to do more than just truck the delivery of courses, that we have something, no matter how we pitch it and change it, right, and respond, that we have something that cannot be replaced by something that is 1/5 less costly, and that is a checkbox on the way to getting your credentials, which is what we are steadily being, I call it terraforming. We're being terraformed away. And I know that sounds very, very depressing. It all depends upon where you are. Minnesota may be unique in all the pressures coming in at once. But it also hits at this point that we have to talk about it in the context of being a professor and keeping the value of that knowledge and expertise and peer review as something that needs to be invested in.
I'm Rob Schneider from Indiana University. I couldn't agree more with what has been said and what's been said generally. And clearly, what we see is that this is a global problem of enormous dimensions. So, but I would like to take a much more sort of modest slice of the problem, picking up, I'm grateful to Jeremy for mentioning early modern or pre-1789 history. And I don't think it's actually irrelevant to the larger question, because I think it actually picks up on what Lloyd said. And I think that's a really interesting point about seeing ourselves as problem solvers. However, paradoxically, I think the way the profession, French history and others, has been going chronologically actually represents a kind of obstacle to that kind of thinking. Because one of the things historians can do, but we do more than what our stuff, is time. Deep time often, at least time beyond just a century or two, which people often adhere to and which has become the sort of center of gravity of history departments and to things like contributions to journals and the like. And there are good reasons for this, given the global perspective that history now has, the transnational move, which tends to be more or less, given the archives in the non-Western world, tend to be more modern. I mean, there are good reasons why there's been a sort of skewing towards the 19th and 20th century, but I think that's created a problem in terms of sort of offering intellectual perspectives on problems in ways that's unique to us. That is to say, we can look at these problems across the longue durée. We can show you how time and the understanding of movement of people, of various developments over time are important. And so I think that's, so the crisis, so to add one little more element to this, one of the crises is, in French history, is a crisis in early modern French history, which is a crisis in early modern European history, which is, contributes, I think, to something that history can ultimately contribute, and yet we're sort of undermining that period or that chronological scope that was often sort of, I mean, you think of medieval history was part of, and you go back in journals, in the HR, for example, medieval history was part of people's bread and butter. Everyone knew something about medieval history as part of their education. And again, for good reasons, because one has just enough time in a graduate 3 or 4 years of taking courses. That's not part of graduate students' required diet, that is to learn medieval history. And again, I think that thwarts something that we can contribute uniquely.
Could I just respond very quickly to that? I do not think that the emphasis on problems is necessarily modern. Let me just give one example. This morning I went to a great panel with Nicole Bauer and Christine Wirtz talking about repression of the Huguenots in 1687, 1686, and the imprisonment of Jansenists and Jesuits in the 18th century. Suspicion of religious difference. I thought, this is a straight line. I mean, I thought of people being held in Guantanamo because they're Muslims, or people in France today. How do we understand a tradition of religious othering? I thought, this is great stuff. And I am and I want to respond in German, this does not mean 20th century history. We could study ancient Greece, for that matter. So I don't think it has to be presidents. And in fact, I would agree, history is precisely the discipline that can broaden the discussion, and that's what we bring to the table.
I think,
Yeah, well,
Except that the undergrad demand among us is for ancient history and medieval, huge undergraduate demand, and inevitably that's going to affect our hiring because we the justification for hiring is going to be based on enrollment. So I think it
Yeah,
will move.
just want to add that you would have to go to the deeper past if you want to kind of figure out, at what point did this emerge? I think about homophobia, or certain ways in which women are treated. Like, you would have to go back. So I think that in sort of the problem-solving model would in fact benefit early modern studies. I think Cynthia had her hand up first. Okay. Okay. Oh, Joelle's the mic. All right, go for it.
Is it okay?
Yeah.
I'm Joelle Newlander from the Citadel, and I'm sort of leaping onto that and going back to the notion of us as humanities together, and particularly in language studies, that one of the issues that we have, and I've certainly seen, my husband does late medieval history, and the issue of where you learn things like Latin. In order to continue to study these things, we need to have the language. And if you're going to be working on medieval France or even early modern France, your language capabilities have to be very high. And so one of the things we as historians really need to continue to do is help those in language departments who are also facing cutbacks not to lose the breadth of the kinds of studies that they have. Without Latin, no one's doing the medieval world. Without ancient Greek, we can talk about Socrates all we want and talk about, and a kind of ethical humanism, but it's difficult to do if you can't read it in the original. And so that's something I think that all of us also need to be helping our language departments and pushing for breadth in language, and that's something we really have to watch out for.
Hi, Cynthia Baughton, Texas A&M University. I'm also at Ground Zero.
Speak up a bit.
Okay. I'm sorry. I have two things to say. One is thank you, Lloyd, for giving me a vocabulary of entrepreneurial models, because when I talk about, I do French history, but then I have to tell them that I do food security and protest and collective violence, and they get it, right? So I think that that's really useful. I have another thing to say in gesturing toward the question that you raised about why PhDs, why research historians, and I think that this is a question of transparency as well, that I have found that I have gotten a lot more traction when I repeat more than I feel like I ought to have to, why it is that research and teaching are synergistic. And I have spent a lot more time in my classes explaining to them what benefit they get when we bring into the classroom the fact that we are researchers, which includes such things as language, learning how to read cursive, which turns out, I guess, students don't learn anymore, but the kinds of things that we can bring into not just information, but the kind of critical thinking skills that we develop associated with that. And I think that the more we're transparent about why those things work together, the more the students perhaps, hopefully, will go home less often and say, well, my professor wasn't listening to me because they were off doing research, which I think is probably part of what's happening, is that some of what we're doing is being partially undermined by using that publish or perish side against us in ways that I think we need to turn it back and explain the ways those two things work together. Thank you.
Where's the mic? So maybe Eric, Jennifer, and then probably we have time for two more. Okay. Sorry, Jennifer.
Jennifer Sessions from the University of Iowa, and I've just been Googling, but I couldn't find it. I just want to put into the discussion the figures that were run by a young scholar, and if anybody remembers his name, I would love to give credit, who sort of looked at this crisis of the humanities and crisis of history, looked at the figures over a longer term, and has connected what we see as a crisis to basically changes in the demographics of the undergraduate student body. And I just think it's worth pointing out that history has been a white male discipline for teaching and for students. And I think even those of us who have majors that have maintained certain numbers, they are far more white and far more male than our sister disciplines in the humanities or social sciences. And we need to ask ourselves questions, not just what topics can we come up with to research that might get traction with larger sort of issues in the world, but what are we doing to speak to students who are not the traditional white male demographic of the field?
Eric Thompson, University of Manitoba. I think that I'm very positive about the value of historians and the value of historical training in the long run. I think in the medium term we have a real problem. What I see in Manitoba anyway is that most of our students, most of our white male students, don't like to read. And thus, no, I mean, it's terrifying to me. Because I think reading and the deep sort of research that goes into doing the old traditional thesis. I mean, you said we're most comfortable with that model. I don't think it's merely that we're sentimental. I think that we see a real intellectual value to that model. And I think that that value is going to persist. So those few students that persist and do it, they're going to have a skill that's really important. Who's going to be around to train it? And all the people that are graduate students now, are there going to be jobs for them in the intermediate time? That's a real prospect of loss. And we might see ourselves with the people not being able to train the Latin, the German, the Dutch, all of these languages that are needed to do scholarship that's interesting on all sorts of important issues. But also that seriousness that I think we're going to need, but it's going to have a hard time surviving in the medium term, I think.
I think we have time for 2 more questions, 2 more statements. I don't know who oh, sorry, Daryl's been waiting for a while. Keith, can you go? Yeah, sorry, Daryl.
Thank you. Daryl Hafter from Eastern Michigan University. Let us not forget the charm of history and the charm of studying history. Television is just galloping along with studies, with stories, with complications, with how do you get out of situations, and so on. People are crazy about learning about these things. And so are we, because that's why we spend hours and hours in the archives trying to figure things out. I don't know the answer to all of these questions, but I do know that the more that we can promote and interest students in these sorts of things, and also in the pleasure of figuring out how and why people in the past did things, and just sort of pause and let them make the connection to how and why we do things, which really is one of the main reasons that we teach, after all. I think that this would be a very positive thing. So even though it may sound a little, frivolous, let's really remember the charm of history and the charm of working at it.
So we have time for one question. We've heard mainly from associate and full professors. Is there any grad student or assistant professor? Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. So I'm Katherine Clark. I teach at MIT, which is also kind of ground zero in entrepreneurial, but also STEM education. And what I wanted to say is I don't have majors. I teach in a language program. There are no majors. There are no minors. There are only students who are doing something else who take my classes. And so we at MIT are very good at articulating why STEM fields need us, and why, if you want to train people in these fields of the future, you need them to learn how to read text, you need them to learn how to make arguments, to identify problems, to synthesize information, and that they're not going to learn how to do that in their lab classes. So I think that instead of just kind of articulating us versus the STEM fields, we should really be thinking about why we are integral to a good STEM education. And at MIT, students take a quarter of their required courses in the social sciences, arts, and humanities, and that might be a good statistic to bring back to STEM education at other universities.
I'm afraid we're a little bit over time. I wanted to thank our panelists and thank you for your discussion. I want to encourage you to go dance on the volcano, to write interdisciplinary, groundbreaking work that people have to read, and to thematically change your class names.